there we go. So I'm Doug Miller. I'm here today on Zoom with Jeff Keighley in British Columbia, Vancouver, I believe, and Jane Armstrong in Toronto to interview Jeff about the his history in the anti-apartheid movement and the union movement's involvement in that on the West Coast. And with that, Jeff, welcome. Nice to see you. Nice to meet you. I'm going to ask you. You've read our consent form and you've understood the conditions and you're quite happy or content to agree to them.
Absolutely, yes.
I always like talking to union guys because that's the least formal thing they ever sign in their lives. So, Jeff, would you just perhaps give us a little personal background before we get into the union side of things? Because people, it would be nice for people to know just a little bit about where you're from and your background before you got involved in activism and unionism and stuff.
Well, I was born in Vancouver and moved to my parents' house in Burnaby at age 2 days, and grew up on Burnaby Mountain. And it was basically mostly British unionized tradespeople in that area. My father was a machinist. My mother was the daughter of a Finnish socialist that they left after the Finland after the whites won that civil war, and they came out to Vancouver. My grandfather was a salmon fisher and boat builder. And basically, I went to school and grew up in Burnaby. And then I went off to BCIT and took construction engineering and in architecture. And one day there, I had went to a lecture a lecture by CUSO, they were interested in recruiting people because they were moving away from simply educational stuff and more into technically qualified people, and got all their information. And my wife and I at the time and I mulled it over, and we ended up going to Jamaica for 2 years, where I taught land surveying and building construction. And that's where I really got heavily involved in the politics, because I'd arrived in Jamaica a month after Michael Manley got elected for the first time, a left social democratic government. And the Black Power movement had been rising and rising and rising. And all of a sudden they were government. And all these people had been hypercritical of various things for very good reason. All of a sudden, my God, we actually have to make the change now. We have control. And as I mentioned to you just before we got started, the very first law that Michael Manley's government passed was to repeal the criminal sanction. This was 1972, repeal the criminal sanction on buying, selling, or possessing a book on evolution. If you had Darwin's Origin of the Species in your house, that was a potential prison sentence for that. That changed a lot of things. The second thing he did was pass a law that said they barred the black suit and white shirt and tie as mandatory dress in Parliament, and said this is a government of the people and it's going to look like the people, and basically adopted the shirt jacket. And I was really getting sort of steeped in the colonialist politics. And then one day, Canadian Dimension decided that they were going to provide a 3-month free subscription for 3 consecutive editions of Canadian Dimension for everybody, wherever they were in the world. I got the first one. I thought, who the hell put my name on this list? But then I read it, and it just made enormous sense. And then I started looking forward to the second one when it arrived. And before I got halfway through the second edition, I took out the mailer and sent it off so I could get the fourth one, because that was only going to be the third one coming for free. And that basically began my exploration of doing a ton of reading and looking at books we made reference to in the Canadian Dimension. And I did a ton of reading on progressive politics, political economy, and it sort of launched myself into an area. I'd gone to Jamaica as a construction specialist, and I was going to go back to Canada at the end of 2 years, and I was going to become a big-time building contractor. And if you had a contract that said you got 3 screws per hinge and you wanted 4, by God, you're going to pay for that 4th screw. By the time I got back to Canada, that stuff didn't interest me, and I thought that what I needed to do was spend my life doing progressive political work. And I started that in Vancouver, and Ken came along, and I ended up, by the time I got, before too long, I worked for CUSO for 2 years doing development education in BC. And then basically at the end of the 2 years, I recommended they abolish my job and give seed money to various progressive groups around the province. And they took that advice. I worked at the IDERA, the Development Education Resource Center in Vancouver. And then I ended up getting enamored with the Canadian union movement because they were doing great progressive stuff, democratic. I took a job at the Kenworth Truck plant, and for reasons that are too long to go into, within 5 weeks, I became a shop steward because I took on the company in a rather stringent way. And within 2 months of being there, I was the assistant chief steward. And the day I started on at the truck plant, at the end of the day, I went up to the union office and said, I've just been hired, what needs doing? And they said, they sat me down, and I read the history, and I was very active in the trade union movement throughout Vancouver with that situation from the truck plant floor. And then Kathy Walker, our health and safety director, who later became the CAW health and safety director after our 1992 merger, was pregnant with her one and only child. And I was asked if I got laid off in 79 along with 179 other people. And I was asked if I would come work for the union for 6 months to stand in for Kathy. And that 6 months turned into 25 years. So it was the longest 6 months of my entire life.
Wow, what a fascinating history. Thank you so much for that. And Ken, welcome to the show. Ken Lukart has joined us. And well, from there, let's talk then about you've gotten into the union and you're part of that. How did you end up becoming aware of and involved in anti-apartheid and union issues related to that part of the world?
Well, when I came back from Jamaica in 1974, I was CUSO was trying to encourage return volunteers to become active on a regular basis, and so I was quite interested in that. And that put me in touch with IDERA. The CUSO office was at the same place as IDERA. And as you and I were talking about earlier, that CUSO was really strongly getting behind the anti-apartheid struggle. So I became introduced to a group of people around IDERA that had formed the SAC, the Southern Africa Action Coalition. And it turns out that we had a major conference in 1976 called South Africa, A Time for Change, which Ken and I have since discovered we were both at the same conference. There was about 125 people. Desmond Tutu was there, Alan Bosak, they were both the PAC and ANC present. And I was thinking about it when the other night, Ken, and I think I recall that I met this frizzy-haired guy who was at the time stationed in Edmonton. And I think you were actually one of the resource people at that.
Yeah, he had hair though.
So did I. So basically, I got involved with the Southern Africa anti-apartheid movement before I joined the trade union movement. But because there was so much activity in and around the Vancouver District Labour Council, being a very progressive group, that gave us connections between the citizen activists and labor activists. And so it became like a seamless whole, so that we're all working on the same thing together. And then through the SAC group, we were organizing a whole series of shop-ins. We would basically organize 30, 40 people to go to the supermarket and with an identified list of South African products, load up their shopping carts with South African products, and then head off, you fill it right up. And then you head off to the cash register, and somebody at the front of the line would say, "What?" They'd pick up a can. This product is for the cashier. This product's from South Africa, isn't it? Oh, well, yes, it is. Well, it looks like all of this is from South Africa. And then somebody would shout, "Have you checked your shopping carts? A lot of this stuff is from South Africa." And people would say, oh my God, this is terrible. And everybody walk out leaving 30, 40 shopping carts filled to the brim,
Tremendous.
all South African products. And it would take hours and hours for the store to have to pay their staff to put it back on the shelf. And you just kept this up. And eventually some of the stores said, look, this is just too much trouble. And so they would start backing off on that. And then also through SAC, at the time, Dave Barrett and the NDP government got elected in 1972. And sadly, I missed 2 of those 3 years because I was in Jamaica at the time. But we decided that we wanted to have South African wines delisted from government liquor stores. And so we started a program. We had these little circular stickers, ban South African wines. And we talked to printers, and this is through SAC, and they gave us stickers that had a particularly strong adhesive. And the idea is you'd go into the liquor store and you'd put this sticker over top of the South African label, and it was impossible to remove the sticker without destroying the label, rendering the bottle a non-saleable product. And with that, with lobbying the BC NDP government of Dave Barrett, got it barred. I recall that my wife, Jill White, and myself and my 2 daughters, we were in the Commercial Drive liquor store. And at that time, they had the display shelves were about 40 inches tall. And so our 2 daughters, 4 and 6 years old at the time, they'd have their pockets stuffed full of these stickers, and we'd be sitting there in the aisle, so away from where the cashiers could see, and I don't think they really cared because it was just a job for them. And we'd be perusing the wine label and looking over. In the meantime, our 2 daughters are down, they're short, they're down below, and they're sticking all these stickers on the bottles of South Africa. And by the time, and when they'd gotten every bottle they could get at, we'd sort of wander on and leave the store, and we'd go off to some other store and do the same thing. So that was my pre-union activities. But then as I became an activist within the my own local 14, which was in the truck transportation local from the Kenworth Truck plant days, I became the editor of our union newsletter. And so we would do all sorts of stories about international affairs, South Africa, the anti-apartheid struggle. And so that, and basically we became, as we moved toward organizing, you had the progressive unions were the Canadian Paper Workers Union, you had the postal workers, you had CUPE, you had CAIMAW, all of the CCU unions were involved, carpenters, and basically we all came together with the Maritime Labor Center, and we began to organize. And then it wasn't too long before Ken and the others in the SAC2 group out of Toronto started to come across the country. And I guess probably because of I remember Doug Coward, he was very heavily involved in the SAC group, and he wasn't a trade unionist at the time, although he became one later. Basically, the SAC2 focus was on activity within the trade unions and the general citizenry, whereas the SAC group was tended to be more citizen oriented, and because of that, it didn't really have the set of kind of staying power that the SAC2 could have. And because if you're going to have long-term social action, you need to have attachment to an organization that has a reason for existing beyond the particular campaign. And trade unions have a reason to exist beyond the campaign because they got to look after their members, 24 hours a day, year after year after year. And so the progressive trade unionists became very critical in both making things happen. And, you go to, you need a poster done. And you could go to a union meeting, you could get, they wouldn't mind giving you a donation of $50 or $100, but that's not a lot of money to do the work. But all of them, they would have they would have to put that to a membership vote. But you could go to the same trade union and say, can you do $500 worth of photocopying for us? And they'd say, sure. They didn't have to put that to a vote. They just did it. And so that the trade unions were absolutely critical, not only in getting the message out to people, but in providing the financing that made it go ahead. And then when Ken Traynor did the tremendous work on the research of all the South African products, and it was then the very best listing that was available. We were working with the ILWU in Vancouver.
ILW?
That's the International Longshoremen Workers Union, which is the longshore union on the West Coast, has always been very left and progressive as opposed to the one on the East Coast. And the Canadian Brotherhood and Railway and Transport Workers, and Tommy McGrath and Dave Crane and people like that who had been on strike in South Africa with the Canadian Seamen's Union, who brought their life experience back to Canadian trade unionists. So it wasn't just some academic talking about the need to do this. These were people who they bought their life experience, and then they were stalwarts that had enormous respect. Tommy McGrath extracted more money out of shipping companies for seamen who didn't get paid than any other person on the planet. And as an aside, Cecil, I forget Cecil's last name, I think Ken knows him, but he tells me this story one time. We're doing some SACTU work, and one night Tommy phones him up about 11 o'clock at night and says, "What are you doing?" So "I'm watching the news." He says, "Good, I'll be there in 20 minutes to pick you up." "What for?" "There's a ship in Vancouver that they haven't paid the crew $650,000. Okay, so they go on board, and Cecil's got a weak stomach, and it's almost all Indian food. And so then Tommy basically tells the pilot, "Drop anchor at this berth." And when Tommy says drop anchor, that ship's not going anywhere, because you can't take the ship out of the harbor without a pilot, and the pilot's not going to cross a CBRT picket line to get on and take the ship. And so they were sitting there for 3 days, demanding that they come up with the money. And eventually, on day 3, a cutter comes out from the wharf bearing a representative of the shipping company. He has a briefcase with $650,000 in $20 bills. They're down in the galley, and the guy comes down, and all the crew are sitting there, and he throws it on the table in the galley and says, "There's your fucking money." And Tommy says, "Count it." "What?" He says, "Count it." Forced the guy to count $650,000 in $20 bills there in front of the crew. And when he finished, he said, "You're satisfied?" And he says, "No, you're short $20. Count it again." And the guy reaches into his pocket and says, "Here's the fucking $20. So that's the kind of moxie that people like that. I mean, and if Tommy said, "This is a struggle you support," people who knew Tommy, you wouldn't even question that. If Tommy says this is a struggle we're supporting, yes, you supported the struggle. So we had enormously strong socialist roots throughout the trade union movement, and we capitalized on that. We'd talk with the Longshore Union, and there'd be a South Africa, based on the work that Ken Traynor did. We'd know that was a ship coming in, and we'd have the manifest ahead of time. And that the docks would start at 6:30 in the morning, and so the longshoremen would say, "Okay, you guys make sure that you're there at 6 o'clock in the morning." And you could get away with 3 or 4 or 5 people there with a picket line. The guys would shout, "Whoa, there's a picket line. We're not crossing the picket line," and off they'd go, and they'd have the day off. And then the shipping companies would seize the pension contributions for the entire month. Then the longshore would go to court, and they would get the money back. But we did it over and over again, and they did it because they were interested in solidarity. Because everybody on the coast, because it is a coastal city, they had enormous amount of travel experience and personal experience, more so than you'd find in an interior city, simply because that's.
I think it's important to point out to people who are listening to this in 2022 that a port wasn't like it is today, where it's all containers. Everything was hand loaded. So their port workers were a huge workforce that was very powerful as a result.
But even with containers, the same thing would happen today. And what that would simply mean is that you end up, and when the port, if you bought in a container ship and you put up a picket line and the union supported it, and maybe there's 6 containers that are containing the the goods that you're trying to have boycotted, that terminal shuts down, then those 6 containers didn't get unloaded, but the other 6,000 also didn't get unloaded. So that creates enormous amount of pressure. On the shipping companies say, we're not shutting down the entire terminal here because you're putting this goods through our port. And so internally, from a very capitalist perspective, it starts to put pressure on the employers to say, we better take some action here, because if these people keep this up, we're not going to shut down the movement of 6,000 containers because they're objecting to 6.
This is tremendous. So let's move back to SACTU Solidarity Committee then. If I'm not mistaken, that would have been 1980 and 1981, when they
bit later, 83, 84. I'm guessing is
well.
More.
Is my voice coming through?
Very
Yes.
well.
Okay, we started. Jeff, I met you when Zola Zembe was on tour in 1981. There was a meeting held by PPWC, Angus McPhee at their local, and you and Jill were both there. And that's when Brendan, who had joined Zola, and I met you and Jill for the first time. That was 1981.
Ken,
Now,
can you tell us what a PPWC is?
Pulp Paper Workers of Canada.
Okay.
It was part of the CCU, the Canadian Confederation of Unions.
Again, CCU?
Confederation of Canadian
Unions.
Okay.
Part of, that's an umbrella organization. Jeff's union was part of that as well. So at that time, there were 2 major confederations in Canada, the CLC and the CCU. And so anyway, that's when we first met, Jeff. That was in 1981. And the stories you're telling about the Longshore is so important to the history of that work in British Columbia. At one point, after Ken had done a lot of that research, and I did a lot of the legwork in BC, and I stayed at your place all the time. We established through Tommy McGrath a connection with the ITF rep, the International Trade ITF, International whatever, the people responsible for all the transportation unions internationally. Jerry McCullough was the person in Vancouver. He and I went out for a cup of coffee and maybe a beer, I forget what, and I explained to him what we were trying to do. And he promised me, and he lived up to the promise, that every ship that would come in from South Africa, the Ned Lloyd Kingston, the 3 ships under the Ned Lloyd line, every ship that came in, he would personally get the manifest of every item from South Africa that was on that ship. Now, that's pretty important stuff.
Oh yeah, you bet it was.
We could then tell where the pulp came from, where it was going, all the stuff that Ken Trainer had researched in the aggregate. We could now begin to identify in the actual location where it was either produced in BC and sent to South Africa, or came in from South Africa and where it would go in BC. That opened up doors we couldn't imagine would open up. For example, we knew that pulp was being produced and sold sent to South Africa. So which plant, a lot of pulp plants in British Columbia, represented by different unions that were in different federations that I spoke about a minute ago. So they didn't like each other as 2 separate unions, but because they were competing over the same jurisdiction. But when it came to South Africa, both presidents, Angus McPhee and I forget the other guy's name in the CLC affiliate, they agreed to send me on tour throughout the entire province to every pulp local in the province. So I could make the presentation that we make everywhere across the country to all of the pulp local unions to try to identify where the hell that pulp was being produced that went to South Africa. So that's the kind of information we could get, because the Longshore people gave us the manifests of stuff coming in or going out to South Africa. We even knew the names of white South African families who were moving to Vancouver. They were either going to Sydney, Australia, they were going to Vancouver, they were going to someplace where it was warm, like it was in Cape Town, where they had come from. We knew the addresses where those people were moving to in the Lower Mainland. We didn't want that information, but we had it. So that's the level of detail that
a manifest provides.
We generate. And people like Jeff were instrumental in helping to coordinate that with the local labor movement in the Lower Mainland.
So Jeff, where are you now at this time when you start running into contact with SACTU?
I guess by that time, I was a national union representative with CAIMAW, and I was responsible for a wide variety of looking after manufacturing plants, all of our mines throughout British Columbia, and some service sector workers.
Sorry,
And
can you do the CAIMA acronym for us?
Canadian Association of Industrial, Mechanical, and Allied Workers.
Okay.
We'd been formed originally in Winnipeg out of the Griffin Steel Foundry there. And it was basically an militant, democratic, all-Canadian union who, amongst other things about proper representation for the members, were set on eradicating American unions from Canada. When the CAIMAW was first started in 64, 65, 75% of all Canadian workers belonged to American-based unions. And basically, in many circumstances, they were working hand in glove with the US State Department. For instance, the United Steelworkers were taking the dues off Canadian steel workers and going to Washington, D.C. and successfully arguing that the United States should put tariffs on Canadian steel coming from Canadian steel plants, with the dues members paying into that process of getting rid of their jobs. So we set out, and I think we had 19 votes against the steelworkers, and we had 19 victories against the steelworkers. And the PPWC went after pulp sulfite. And basically, we had a policy: we would never ever raid a Canadian union. Our rationale was that if it's in Canada, you have the capacity. If you're serious about making your union democratic, you have the capacity within our national boundaries to make that change. Whereas if you're in the United States, or if you're in an American union, there's no chance that you're going to have any impact or change on the American union's constitution. And you're and a huge chunk of your dues, the more levels of bureaucracy that you have to service, the fewer dollars that are available to deal with the members who are paying the freight. And so by the time Bob White, we were partly inspirational for Bob in basically telling the UAW to get stuffed in the creation of the Canadian Auto Workers Union. By the time he got settled after 2 or 3 years, he came to us in the West Coast and said, "We would like you to consider joining the CAW. We want to make the CAW a national union." And we spent an entire 2 years going around talking to our members, and then we put it to a referendum vote, and overwhelmingly in January 1st, 1992, CAIMAW disappeared and merged into the Canadian Auto Workers, and giving the CAW a base in the 4 Western provinces that had never existed previously. And that led to virtually every other CCU union, one by one, joining in, because the CAIMAW had been the lead union within the CCU. And once they saw what we had done, and they asked us, "Well, what do you think?" Well, we said, it's a big union, it's got lots of bureaucracy, but we were in our 25th CAIMAW convention. We had a big celebration, and we were just on the verge. That's where we made the decision, in Winnipeg. And to celebrate, the union had booked one of the riverboats, and we were going on a 4-hour riverboat cruise. And a friend of mine, also from my own local, he said, "Well, what do you think about this idea of joining the CAW?" And I said, "Roy, we have been like this little ship fighting the waves and going upstream because we wanted to get to a certain place where we could have a fully Canadian union movement that was democratic and militant. And the CAW, despite its flaws, it's a much bigger ship, but it's generally heading in the same direction. I think we ought to join that bigger ship." And he said, "I think you're right." And so the membership vote was just overwhelming. And when we first sat down with Jim O'Neill, who was then the Secretary Treasurer, came out to shortly after had the merger gone through, and we were involved in SAC2. We were involved in, if there was a international solidarity movement going on, we were there. I was heavily involved in the Chilean solidarity movement after the coup. And we said to Jimmy, he said, look, we've been doing these things for years and years and years. Like we're right up front there as a political organization on all this work and domestically as well. And his response was, all right, we came to you because we liked what you were doing. You were doing what you were doing in the name of CAIMAW. You're now part of the CAW. You do what you continue to do what you're doing, but you're now doing it in the name of the CAW. And if we've got a problem with that, we'll come and talk to you. But if we don't come and talk to you, we don't have a problem. And we just carried on. And we built.
Wow, what a tremendous synopsis history of the CCU, CAIMAW, and how this CAW and you collaborated. But if I could just take us back to SACTU again.
Yep.
And so in the early 80s, what was going on around that issue and those issues? You've had visits already, 81, from a South African trade unionist and Ken and Brenda. What else?
Basically, most of what had taken place up to the time we created the SACTU Solidarity Committee Vancouver, which is basically modeled on what the SACTU folks had done in and around Toronto. It had been somewhat trade union movement, somewhat citizen driven, but it didn't have the sort of the continuity that was necessary to put pressure on it. So when Ken came out and suggested that we consider creating the Vancouver Solidarity, Vancouver Committee of SACTU, there was probably 10, 15 of the progressive trade unionists gathered together. And we said, absolutely, that's what we're going to do. And so we then started working more closely with both Ken's and Brenda and Jane, less so Vince because he had a different bailiwick at the time. And we started doing organizing, we started doing education. We'd go around to the various unions, the union meetings, and talk about it. We'd be helping get them to make ongoing commitments to finance the SACTU committee, because we said, look, this is the long struggle, and it's great if you give $100 once in a while. It'd be a hell of a lot better if you give $75 a month or whatever you could afford. And more unions were basically coming on board, and they would pass a motion, and so that every month the check would go off to Toronto to keep the work going. And then we started organizing a series of benefits, and I think we had the first benefit in 1986, and couldn't get everybody into the Maritime Labor Center. And then the second one we had, it was in 87, it was May 8, 1987, and we had a real great lineup. We had the Total Gospel Choir out of Seattle come up, and we had a huge program lined up. And back in those days, people drank a lot more when they went out than they do now. So that helped to raise the money. And at the end of the night, I was the chair of the SACTU committee in Vancouver, and we had paid all of our people, nominal gratuity or honorarium, really, paid all of our expenses. And on Sunday morning, my two daughters, who were the label stickers on the wine bottles, got to count the money, and they were just overjoyed. And we had raised more than $12,000 that night.
Holy smokes!
And then we that was the high point. I think the third one we had in yes, it was 80. That was the September of 89. We did almost as well, but by that time people were a little bit more sensible how much they imbibed. On that $12,000 night, we were probably just as lucky that there were no RCMP hanging around the Maritime Labor Center nabbing people before they went home, because you can't make that kind of money drinking tea.
No, no, the bar bill is really a good one.
But what we basically made solidarity work not only pointed and political, but fun. I mean, years later, when we created, when the SACTU work had sort of fallen by the wayside because of the success of putting apartheid to bed, we started the anti-war movement in Vancouver. And after the Americans went into Iraq, we had a big benefit to do that. And the biggest moneymaker we made, we put together a box of wine as a raffle, and we made about $900 off the raffle, and every single bottle of wine came from a country that did not endorse the US coalition in going into Iraq. So this was a solidarity case of wine, and people bought it like crazy. So we're just creative ideas to get people together. And we basically, you know, but Rosa said, you know, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your movement. And we took that to heart. And so we made solidarity work meaningful and fun. And people's friendships were built on that. And I still have friends today that the only reason I met them was because of the international solidarity work that we'd been doing at that time.
And in terms of your union and its commitment to SACTU and the anti-apartheid, how would you define that relationship to a union, which is negotiations and collective agreements?
Well, with the CAW, Ken and both Kens and Jane and Brenda had done really good work with Bob White, and Bob White was a brilliant guy. And the CAW, once they left the UAW, became the CAW, they became one of the leading lights. And we created in the CAW the Social Solidarity Fund, and the SACTU work and solidarity work was a big chunk of that. And we weren't successful in every collective bargaining session, but it became an obligation of every union and every national rep that they were to bargain as much as possible into the Solidarity Fund. And so that our entire membership, whether they'd been successful in getting the company to go with it, they had, in their own way at the various locals, they'd all been part and parcel of approving that, yes, this is a valid thing to put on the table, and that, you know, if it's 10 cents, 15 cents, 25 cents, whatever they were able to get, everybody would understand that that's money that otherwise could have gone to their wages, but that they collectively decided to put to international solidarity work. And then when the Mandela's election was coming up in '94, thankfully on Ken's recommendation, the trade union movement around the world had been asked to supply teams to go into South Africa to do violence monitoring 6 or 7 weeks in advance of the actual election. Ken had put forward my name, and so I led a joint CAW-CUPE delegation into South Africa. We went from Johannesburg down to Cape Town. We ended up in Inkatha territory with an ANC guy. We went into the Thousand Hills area, and we took a bunch of Mandela election posters. It was just one of the greatest things in my life was to be in the Cape Town City Hall, in the plaza. Every lamppost had a Mandela poster on it ahead of the election. And we took a stack of them into Thousand Hills to deliver them to a principal of a school in that area. And we went in there, the whole of the 5 of us, there were 5 of us, 3 CAW and 2 people. And we had to put the posters face down, so when we got stopped traffic, people couldn't look into the car and see, identify with ANC. We delivered the posters to the ANC, and then we went to the principal. And we went to see the chief in one area, and he wasn't home. And so we waited and we looked, but we ran into him on the road, and he'd come back from a meeting with the Inkatha chief across the dried up river wadi. And the Inkatha chief wasn't particularly loyal to Inkatha, but the difference was that the ANC by policy would only support one of the wives, but Inkatha would support several wives. So as a result of Inkatha's being prepared to support several of the wives, he was loyal to Inkatha. But he was, beyond that, he said, look, told this chief, you better get your people out of there. There are 3 busloads of armed Inkatha people coming in here, next week, and they intend to kill everybody they can find. So we had a quick meeting with him, and he said, well, I can't stay. I got to get people out of here. They were gonna send them over the hills, and with the expectation that all the houses would be burned, but it was at least going to save the people. And so I said, is there anything we can do? And he said, the only thing that will save us is if the army comes in. And I said, you trust the white South African army? And he says, no, but they will have to document stuff so thoroughly that if the army's here, Inkatha won't dare to come in. So we beetled it back to Cape Town, and I got on the phone with Bob White and CLC and the International Trade Union Federation and Lloyd Axworthy, who was then a major factor in there, and basically started raising hell. And the telegrams started flying back and forth. And the military did come in, and it avoided the massacre. But when I got back to Canada, I got a report that the principal that we had delivered the posters to had been macheted to death because he was distributing the Mandela posters.
Holy Jesus. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's a really tough one. Oh, so there we are. SACTU is being promoted on the West Coast. You have a committee going. The labor union was also working very hard to promote within the labor movement, SACTU. There were divisions at certain levels, particularly from the CLC.
Yes.
How did you read all of that from the West Coast where you were sitting?
Well, anybody who understood who was active on the West Coast knew that the conservative CLC unions weren't. And so, and every one of the conservative CLC unions had a lot of good people in it. Just that the leadership weren't necessarily particularly good. So we were able to, because we had developed such a track record of being credible and having success, that all sorts of locals of American unions that basically could care less about the South African issue, where they were nevertheless, they would pick up the issue within their own local, even if they weren't getting support at their national level. And so we were we were able to perform a leadership function because of our established track record. And we were up in the Pacific Northwest where the Kitimat smelter is. They were the CAIMAW, that was the Canadian Association of Smelter and Allied Workers. And they were part of the Confederation of Canadian Unions. They were very active. And John Jensen from the Carpenters was really active up there. And John Jensen, when I first met him, he's a great socialist. He sat down with me in a cafe when I first met him. And he says, "Now look," he says, "I don't have a lot of time to waste with people that I don't trust." He said, "I'm not one of those guys who wants to get a better share of the bakery. I want to own the fucking bakery. So if you're one of the guys who wants to own the bakery, then fine." And in the Pacific Northwest, CAIMAW was part of the CCU and therefore was a rival to the CLC. And the CLC leadership at the time, and I think it was probably under Shirley Carr, forbade the Northwest, or the Labor Council, Terrace and District Labor Council, from having anything to do with the CCU and CAIMAW in particular. But the smelter didn't work without CAIMAW. That they were the union in town. And so they decided that they were going to form the Pacific Northwest Labor Council, and it would be open to all unions, and basically told the CLC, "Go fuck yourself. If you have a problem with it, you ain't getting dues from anybody." And so the CLC basically shut their mouths because they weren't going to risk not getting dues from all the CLC affiliates, because they took the position, we're going to get workers are going to fight with workers, or together with workers, and we're going to do this, and we don't give a shit what Ottawa has to say. And to a certain extent, that sentiment existed for lots of the CLC affiliated unions, particularly all the Canadian unions that were affiliated to the CLC, but also to some of the better locals of the American unions. So they basically said, we know who's doing the work, we know who to trust, and we don't really care if the national union has a policy that doesn't support this, we are going to support this. And it's our union dues. At the local level, they say, this is our union dues. If you have a problem with that, you know, they didn't quite get to do the Pacific Northwest thing and said, we'll stop sending you any money. But basically the CLC was made to look the other way, because they couldn't risk the internal divisions that would be caused if they tried to force the issue. But that was based on courageous individuals who had a political commitment and just moving forward with the work.
Jane, did you want to get in here?
No, it's just, you know, ringing all sorts of bells as you talk. And some of these stories I'd never heard before, and others I had. I was wondering about what interaction you might have had with the Vancouver District Labor Council. I think Marion Pollock might have been the president of the Labor Council in the late 80s.
Yeah, she was. John Fitzpatrick was the president for many years, and he was terrific. He was a great supporter of SACTU and any solidarity work going on. And then Marion, who was an absolute gem of a leader within the postal union, she was also did an amazingly great job as president of the Vancouver District Labor Council. And again, it was the Vancouver District Labor Council was the home of the progressives.
Ken, did I see you waving?
Yeah, a couple things. This has been great. Just things you may have forgotten, Jeff, that I wanted to add to this videotape here. When the sanctions movement was getting strength and we were encouraging workers to take actions at the workplace, the local committee in Vancouver organized a very successful sanctions conference. And at that conference, we invited Leo Robinson, who was the main activist in San Francisco with the ILWU, Longshore Workers Union in the States. Well known in labor history as being probably one of the most important anti-apartheid activists in the United States. So Leo came to Vancouver for the conference that local committee in Vancouver had organized. It was a tremendous success and was a further inspiration to unions in the Lower Mainland to take actions at their own workplaces and in support of all sorts of sanctions. That's one point I wanted to mention. Also, you mentioned John Jensen. He was critical for the work up in the Northwest, Prince Rupert, Terrace, Kitimat. And before he died recently, he has written his own memoirs, been published now as a book. And I forget the title of it, but everyone should try to get a copy of John Jensen's memoirs. It's fantastic. And he talks about the stories that you're talking about, Jeff. And finally, I just want to mention that when we do this work across the country, it wasn't just going to a meeting, it was also where are you going to sleep? You know, I probably made, I forget how many trips to BC, 4 or 5 a year. I would stay for 2 or 3 weeks, usually in Vancouver area. And I would stay at Jeff's house. So his family would put me up, look after me, find me a place to live, to be with his daughters, with his dog, Tanya, I think. Was that her name?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so that was part of it. And so the solidarity is more than just arranging meetings and just doing things like that. It's being able to go somewhere and be trusted and be accommodated as part of the work. So the Vancouver committee and all the people involved were very, very instrumental in the development of this active work across the country. That's all I wanted to add.
Well, it's wonderful. Thank you. Jeff?
With the ILWU, the longshoremen on the west coast of Canada and the United States, they were unique in that they were progressive on both sides of the border, but it started out and was an American union, but they constitutionally and politically and practically gave full autonomy to the Canadian organization. And so they were never under the thumb of State Department policies, because they were basically progressives in charge there on both sides. Our house was the SAC2 Hotel, and then later the COSATU Hotel and the ANC Hotel. And Peter Mishlangu, which I know have had some problems down the line, but he was staying in our place quite regularly. And we were going out to a major public meeting at the Britannia Center in Off Commercial Drive in Vancouver. And I was chairing the meeting, and he was a terrific speaker in the sense that he could speak right off the cuff. And I'm sitting down, we're just finishing up dinner, but getting ready to go out, and I'm making some notes. And he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm just making some notes for tonight's meeting. He said, well, don't you know what you want to say? I said, yeah, I know what I want to say. And he said, I'm just going to get my notes together. And he said, Jesus Christ, he said, if we were running around South Africa with our notes tucked in our back pocket, we'd all be dead. And he was a tremendous speaker. And my older daughter, Kristen, when we moved out to Port Moody, and it turned out that one of the times Peter was at our house, he'd been there for several weeks, and Kristen had to do a show and tell. She was 12 years old at the time, in elementary school. She had to do a show and tell. So what to do? So she said, Peter, can I take you to school as the show and tell? And he said, sure. And she talked with her teacher, who said, sure. And so she took Peter to school as a show and tell, and they assembled the entire school in the auditorium. And he spent an hour talking to all of the kids about the anti-apartheid struggle, about South Africa, and we just mesmerized it. And years later, she ended up with a racist prick of a teacher, and we'd gone to it, and he'd had all sorts of, like, at one point there was a First Nations kid in the class, forget the kid's name, and he'd done really well on an assignment, and the teacher stands and picks up, let's call the kid Bobby. Look at Bobby, he's got an A, and he's Indian. And there've been all sorts of things coming up. We were there for a parent-teacher interview, and it was one of the ones where you bring your kid along. It's not sometimes it's just the parents. This was the one where they bring the kids along, and they'd had world maps all around. The kids have been coloring, and I walked around, and every country in the world was labeled except for Africa. There were no countries labeled in Africa, and it was white space, and they'd colored all the rest of it. And I'm sitting there, he says, what's his name? Ross. I said, Ross, do you have any reason why all of these maps have labeled every other country except in Africa? Not one of them has a label, not one of them colored. And he says, oh yeah, you know, in Africa, they have all got names like Huba Gooba Juba. And Kristen is 12 years old, sits there. She goes, I think his name was Wilson. Mr. Wilson, I have friends from South Africa, and none of them have names like Huba Gooba Juba. And I said to him, I said, Ross, have you ever considered a career in real estate? And we went home. My wife's a teacher, and they have a code of conduct. You cannot criticize a teacher unless you've gone to deal with the teacher face to face. And so she couldn't do that as a BCTF colleague. But a couple of days later, I made arrangement I went in and met with the principal, and I said, look, this guy you've got here is a complete racist. I went through the explanations, and I said, here's the deal. Either you get rid of him or I get rid of him. I said, if you get rid of him, you'll be able to do it quietly. But I assure you, if I set out to get rid of him, it won't be done quietly. And that was in the afternoon. And the next day I was on my way to work to the union office, And about an hour before school started, and the principal and his car were in the parking lot, and that's the last day he was at that school. Unfortunately, like the Catholic Church, they shuffled them off to do damage elsewhere. But it was, I mean, that the South African consciousness, my kids were growing up with it. That's how they live life.
You put it into their DNA.
Yep,
That
from a
means-
very early age.
Go.
That leads to, I guess, another question. To what degree do you think the anti-apartheid work in the 80s made a difference to unions going forward into the 90s in terms of building Black and Aboriginal caucuses, in terms of changing what was basically systemic racism within the union movement? Did you see some of those same people who had been key activists being able to move forward with that kind of work over the 90s?
I would say yes. There was no question that South Africa was amongst the most egregious example that you could look at for discrimination. And only the willfully naive could ignore that. So so that helped all sorts of people, myself included, see far lesser examples of discrimination and racism as being in the same ilk and the same path. And I think that helped a lot. I used to be when we were in the CCU, I was the director of the BC CCU labor schools. And one of the exercises that I put forward, and it was very largely helped along and inspired by the South Africa anti-apartheid work I'd done, I wrote a one-page outline called Sam Stone's Dilemma. And it was a little story about Sam Stone, who his family used to fish on the Fraser River up in the Caribou, but the railway had cut them off and the highway came in and they fenced them in doing this various things. They told him he couldn't do these various things. And so I would have the groups break into groups of 5 or 6 people. And I wanted them to come up with an action plan as to what Sam should do. And so they all work together, and then it take about half an hour, and they come back, and they were going to organize boycotts. They were going to put a picket line across the railway, where they're going to stop. There were all sorts of militant things, and it was a wonderful exercise. And then we'd break for lunch, and people would be talking. And after lunch, I'd sit back and I'd say, "Oh shit, I'm really sorry. I forgot one detail about Sam Stone." And the people would look and say, "Sam Stone's Native." And all of a sudden people go, wow, all the things we were advocating is exactly what First Nations people are up against. So those things melded together, and those kind of exercises that people would go say, we really got to start rethinking some of the things, how we do things. And they would carry those stories back to their plants. And that would help. I mean, when I was in the truck plant, Kenworth Truck plant, we had been an old machinist union that we killed there, and we knocked them out. And the company was real assholes, and they had a provision in there that the company had the right to veto what the union put up on the union bulletin board. So when we wanted to put something up on the bulletin board, and not everybody would read the bulletin board, and we maybe have covering 4 or 5 different issues, we would make sure that we put something on there that just pissed the company off like crazy. And they would demand that we take down the bulletin. And because the entire plant had heard the company wanted to take down the bulletin, absolutely 100% of the people went to read every single one of the 4 or 5 articles in there, and only one of them was there to piss the company off, because we knew that got the attention of 100% of the people. And we would do stuff, whether it was on South Africa, whatever. And so the next time around, when we said at the bargaining table, no, it's our bulletin board. Fuck yourself. You don't have any control over what we put on the bulletin board. And the company realized they'd been duped once too many times, so maybe they ought to agree with that.
It's amazing the different places and how some very big and some very small, how that kind of action takes place. I'm going to turn back to Ken and to Jane, and are there issues to cover that you think perhaps we haven't quite looked at yet?
Not really. I mean, I think that Jeff's already given the correct impression of how many people were involved in BC. The BC had a very strong progressive labor history. So that all the unions that supported us back in Eastern Canada had their locals in Vancouver as well, the postal workers, CUPE, et cetera, et cetera. They then were ready to join a committee in Vancouver, which Jeff and others helped to organize. So I think it was just organic growth, a good politics, and a commitment from a lot of people to do good work. Fundraising, research, check out your own plants. Are there connections that we don't know about? It was great.
Action
And,
action as well.
You need leadership, and people like Jeff, Susan Stout, and others were instrumental. I know Jeff's going to help us find some of those activists who are still alive in Vancouver, in BC, to also interview through your work, Doug.
Do you have much recollection of the week of action in March of 1986 that we had called for? And it was basically airline workers refused to handle phone calls, postal workers refused to handle mail. Do you have much recollection of that week at all in Vancouver?
Yeah, no, not in great detail, but there were lots. There were Hospital Employees Union was another progressive group, and a lot of the bulk food products coming in the great large cans were coming out of South Africa, and so that week there was a lot of identification of product in government institutions. And similarly in prisons, any place where you're doing bulk cooking, a lot of that was getting low cost black labor produced product, and which meant it made it financially attractive to major institutions to do bulk purchases. And the various unions involved, and the BCGU was involved in some of their prison work to bring that out. The airlines, as you mentioned, because that's where you came out of. So yeah, there was a lot of that work. The postal workers have been doing a lot of some of the places. There wasn't most of the workplaces. There wasn't something that you could actually focus on. So there you had to it was more a matter of getting information out, and they would read about the bulletins on the board or in newsletters, talking about what was going on and why it was going on, even if there wasn't something that was immediate to their work situation that they could do about it. But where it was, they were hearing enough stories that were what they could see is 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different kinds of workplaces that could take action, were taking action. And that sends the message that this is a legitimate form of political organizing, even if you're not particularly involved in it. Because who knows, next time there may be something that you could do in your workplace, whether it's to do with South Africa or some other issue. But it basically sent the message, and the education work that had gone on. And that by that time, the BC Fed was actually doing some fairly decent stuff. And they weren't entirely on board with the myopic view of the CLC. I mean, as Ken said, it was a more progressive labor movement in BC, but that also meant that the BC Fed was on the left-hand side of the spectrum within the CLC as well. And they were doing more work than they had previously done, and credit should go to them as well.
I just mentioned as well, in that week, one of the Ned Lloyd ships came into port in Vancouver. And in addition to the documentation, which we always got, the longshore people refused for 3 days to touch any of those goods.
Yep.
Wow. That's powerful stuff. Well, I think we've spent a rather good hour or so here. And I want to thank you, Jeff, very much. And
Oh,
we certainly will be back to you. There's many other
sending
avenues to explore.
connection too.
One of the things that is of interest to the project of gathering anti-apartheid is that we have lost a number of our comrades over the years. And so any stories you can think of that tell the story as you did with Tom McGrath and others, those are, I think, part of the history that could be missing unless those of us who remember them tell them. So, we could meet again, but for the moment, I want to thank you. Unless there's anything else for the moment, did you think of anything we missed?
Oh,
I can't believe you guys don't know each other from all these years.
What was that?
I can't believe you haven't met each other, Doug and Jeff. I don't think you, over the years. I mean, I would have thought you'd cross paths.
Well, there's a lot of miles between here and Toronto.
My directional poles point to Southern Africa, so I rarely go westwards. I've been out to BC, I think, twice in my life now.
Right, you know, I'm 72 and I've yet to drive across the country.
I managed that once. Listen, let me turn the recording off, but before I do, I'll just say thank you, and then we can chat as much as you want. So I want to thank you, Jeff, very much for contributing like this. If you ever think of other issues to bring up or ideas to propose about this same history, we'd be happy to reconnect and redo this. And again, thank you. And thanks to Ken and Jane for being there with us. Great contributions.
Sorry, I was late getting on. I can't figure this stuff out.